So the topic, of course, is Laudato Si, the Pope Francis Encyclical on the environment, but it's that and more. As you can see here, the outline, we'll have an opening prayer, one of the prayers that are part of the document. And then I want to place this in the context of the church's mission and Catholic social teaching in general, because it's part of a body of work, a body of how should I say, of our tradition, part of who we are. And so he's added, another component to that, as has every pope. And he's actually had a few there. John Paul wrote a lot, Benedict, all the popes. So it's all part of the richness of our Catholic social doctrine tradition. And then we'll get into what this one's about, why we write it, and then what we'll go through an overview of it, and then where do we go from here? Not that everything will be answered in that regard, but where would we start if this is newer concepts? So let's start with this prayer, which is on the inside page. And this prayer, there are two prayers in there because he uniquely wrote this encyclical. Usually it's written to bishops, encyclicals, and they're written to bishops, but meaning all the bishops of the world, and so it's a universal thing, and then clergy and the faithful. But this is written to every person on the planet who is part of the earth, who lives on the earth. And one of the prayers is a Christian prayer that we'll pray at first. And then the other one is for people of faith, but non-Christian, believers. So it's with that idea that we're reaching out beyond just the Catholic Church. So let us pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And I'll pray it aloud, and you can listen along and read along. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They come forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world toward the Father's love. You accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you, triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love. Teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us your place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. That prayer, as we go through this, and if you're familiar with Pope Francis Encyclical Laudato Si, here's just one of the ways it's been captured in a book, but there are a lot of publishers who put that together. But as you read it, this prayer just is a great summary with some excellent Trinitarian theology. That's another lecture, but I, as I said, I want to place this document, this teaching, this encyclical, in the context of what we're all about as Catholics. Because the Pope, his main mission is to evangelize the world, to draw the world, everybody on the planet, to Jesus Christ. That's why we're here. That's our main reason, and we don't have a reason other than that. And everything is an expression of that, everything that we do. Sometimes it's harder to find that line back from some action like, balancing a budget or buying a new fire extinguisher. But it does point back eventually to how do we proclaim the gospel in such a way that people hear it because they're going to feel safe because they know there are fire extinguishers in the school. And then they're better able to listen and hear. So what's the purpose of being church? That's a fundamental thing, and all of this is part of that. I love this quote from Father Roger Schroeder. We often think of, a church or an organization. What's our mission statement? We try to discern what our mission statement is so that we can do what we're called to do better. But actually, the church really doesn't have a mission. The mission has a church to do its work. The mission is Jesus proclaiming everybody should know of his resurrection and his salvation for the world. That's the mission. And then we're the agents of that mission. It's already established. It's not like we have to figure that out. But it's good sometimes to focus on certain things in your own particular circumstances, like this parish in Lake Oswego. And so we kind of dial it in a bit, but it's fundamentally to proclaim the gospel. In fact, last Sunday we heard that reading from Acts of the Apostles. That what did the early church do? That's really essentially what we're called to do. They devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the scriptures, the tradition of our faith, the creed, the doctrine and the dogmas that we hold dear. And to the communal life. So we're called to build a community of life, to reconcile with each other, love one another, love the least of our brothers and sisters, those who are hurting the most. That's the communal life. Plus, respect each other, live an ethical, moral life, because that's how we interact and relate with each other. So all of that, morality, Catholic social teaching is part of that. Breaking of the bread, so engaging in the sacraments, that's breaking the bread always means Eucharist. So sacramental life of the church, that's also what they did in the early days and we do still today. And then being people of prayer. People of prayer doesn't mean just people who spend so much time in prayer, but that we recognize we're absolutely dependent upon God. And our prayer is many things, but it's being just in communion with God, our Creator. But it's also prayer is making prayer petition, or gratitude, thanksgiving, worship. But it unites us either individual prayer or public prayer, public worship. And then, so that's in our own day. Pope John Paul coined that term, the new evangelization. It's really the old evangelization we should always be doing. But it's recognizing our own circumstances. We're in Europe and first world nations. There's a lot of drift in faith, and when you look at just our own neighborhoods here, oh gosh, people aren't going to church as much. The next generation isn't baptizing their kids, and we can lament that. But when we look at the global church, Africa and Latin America and Asia, there's an explosion of faith. In Vietnam, they can't build seminaries quick enough, nor can they in Nigeria, and religious orders and vocations, and it's a lot. So when we look at that global church, and that's part of the question, we're called to evangelize. But in the Europe and U.S. and Oceania, there's a call to. We have to find ways to not change the fundamental teaching, but how we present it. And so that's what John Paul has called the church to do. But he's following on the heels of Pope Paul VI, who promoted the same thing. And then the popes since John Paul, of course, Benedict and Francis have all taken up that torch. And we hear about that a lot in our parish too. We should, it's not that people get born into a Catholic family and then you're Catholic. We should also, anybody should be welcomed into the faith. So, in fact, Pope Paul VI even put it so bluntly, the church exists to evangelize. That's the only reason we're here. But frankly, growing up, I didn't think about evangelization growing up in the 60s and 70s. I didn't think that we were here to evangelize. I grew up in a Catholic family, and we were missing a key element of what we're called to do. And I think that's what Pope John Paul is speaking to our day. I mean, he was a great pope for how he helped us to move into that, to embrace that call. So then Catholic Social Doctrine is a part of that. It's how we live that gospel and promote that gospel by creating a more just society, or by living in such a way that's consistent with the gospel for the sake of justice. And it's really part of moral theology. In fact, I mentioned John Paul, New Evangelization. He also wrote remarkable encyclicals on various topics of justice, social justice, that global concept. So I'd like to just mention, okay, what is that? How do we understand social justice? How does it fit into our church's teaching? Because for a lot of us, and I'm saying baby boomers and a little older and maybe a little bit younger, it seems like a newer thing. And yeah, I guess it is as a field of study or a field of focus or a sense of mission. But it's something that we've grown to understand. And this theologian who's been called by Pope John Paul II and also Pope Benedict XVI to be a part of some Vatican academic enterprises, this Russell Hittinger, he says it this way, that this new doctrinal specialty is placed within moral theology. So social justice, Catholic social teaching is part of our moral theology. We often think of moral theology as a, individual, how I treat someone. Is this a right decision to make, in this moral dilemma that I'm facing? But it has a broader impact than just one-to-one relationships or small group relationships, or it has what are the areas of societal sin or societal ethical decision making that we need to be conscious of. And you'll see that's what prompted the development of this doctrine, Catholic Social Doctrine. So he recognizes this is placed within the moral theology because, as John Paul II insisted, our Catholic Social Doctrine must reflect on the complex realities of human existence in society and in the international order in the light of the gospel teaching on man and his vocation. So it's all gets back to the fundamental gospel. And moral philosophy and theology overlap insofar as they study the right ordering of human action to ends. How do we put our faith into action and treat people? Social doctrine is particularly interested in the social virtues, broader than just one-to-one, and charity and justice by which the person is right with God and neighbor. That's a real nice definition of what moral theology is. It's right relationship, being in right relationship with each other. The reason I do this thing or don't do this thing, because if I do it, it will strengthen our relationship. That's a good thing, virtue. Or if it's morally problematic, it could hurt our relationship if I do this thing, or hurt my relationships in general. And so it's being in right relationship. And this is on a grander scale when we think of Catholic Social Doctrine. So there's personal sin and social sin. Now, personal sin is that, those individual relationship, and it's a wound. We think the catechism, I like that it refers to sin as a wound. It's a wound in our relationship with God, relationship with each other. But social sin could be as a wound, but it's not just a personal one. It has a bigger impact. And so this Russell Hittinger goes on to describe it this way, and in this same article that I'm quoting from. It's just how do we, if morals in interpersonal morality has to do with building a good relationship, well, how do we have a healthy society? Not just a healthy one-to-one relationship, healthy marriage, healthy friendships, healthy community life. How do we do that on a global scale? And that has to do with how we understand society. And I like how Hittinger describes this. There are 3 ways, this is top of page 4. There are 3 ways to destroy a society. And when I'm saying this, think about like the Civil War, some way where society was really at the brink of being destroyed. The American Civil War, or any Civil War. There's 3 ways to destroy society. First, by destruction of its members or its matter. You destroy the economy, or you destroy people or their things, devastate a city, bombings or things like that. So that can destroy society. Second, by the disintegration of the aim to achieve common ends through united action. Our common end is people should have liberty to speak their mind and and have freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and expression. That's a common end. When somebody wants to restrict that, we get upset about that because we agree on the value of that. But if you destroy that, or if you find we can't even communicate because we differ so much on things, that can hurt the common end. If we say, oh no, our sense of purpose and direction as a nation is harmed because we can't even agree on what the goals are, okay, that could destroy a society. And the Civil War, is a good example of that. Slavery might have been one of the major issue, but there are a lot of discussion about that, which again is another conversation. But you can see they just couldn't even see the same direction, and that leads to the third thing that destroys society, by destroying the instrument of authority that coordinates the common action. So once the South seceded from the Union, the instrument of unity was lost, and they had their own president, and President Lincoln was trying to keep the country united and the Union, and then there were the Confederate States. You can see that when they lost that common instrument, it could destroy the society. So I think that's a good example of where we were at risk as a nation. We know, if you know anything about American history, it was a crucial time. So that's for the work of social justice. How do we preserve the members or its matter? How do we preserve the common ends with the united action? How do we preserve the tools, the instruments of authority that coordinate a common action? That helps and make sure that they're healthy and effective. So that's the work of social justice. And so the first teaching in that body of teaching on what we consider Catholic Social Doctrine is Rerum Novarum. It came along in 1891. So it is in the history of a 2,000-year-old church. 1891 is last week. So it's recognizing as the industrial age took off, and then there were factories and there were jobs in cities, and people moved to cities to get those jobs, but the owners of those factories, they just weren't thinking in these terms, but they were thinking about profit, and so they weren't thinking about labor rights. It just hadn't dawned on them, or just maybe the profit drives just became so strong. They started ignoring the safety of workers, the rights of workers, how many hours they work. When you're a family farm and everybody works lots and lots of hours, but you're also it's part of your building your family, and everybody's participating in the livelihood. Everybody benefits from the work that everybody does. There's a common purpose and a common benefit, but if the only one benefiting is not any of the workers, or so many of the workers, and then the only one benefiting are the owners, which are a very, very, very small subset, and then workers can become exploited. This is what Pope Leo XIII was so concerned about. He said, we're in a whole new social situation, and we've become blind to the concerns of some of those who are paid on the lowest scale and can barely not even support their families, and are working ridiculous hours, and before the 5-day work week or any of those kind of principles that we hold now. So that was the beginning of it, just a pope, a pastor, responding to issues that are facing the world in a new way. It was a new experience, new awareness. So I'd like to draw your attention to this first addendum, and it's after page 10. And I'll just look at this very briefly. But after page 10, the addendum, foundational documents to the Catholic social teaching. This is found on the U.S. Bishop's website. It's a nice listing of these kind of documents and their historical order. So at the top, Rerum Novarum, but then in the 40th year after Rerum Novarum was promulgated, Pope Pius XI felt the need to reiterate and then address new issues that had come along in the day. But all of these teachings, all of these writings are in that tradition, the beginning of that tradition. And And you can see it continues on. You can study this later, but there's a broad variety. The Second Vatican Council, what is the role of the church in the modern world, to speak of these matters and right relationship in broader society. The religious freedom, what does that mean? There's a few that are written on kind of referring back to Rerum Novarum. One is 80 years after Rerum Novarum, and then Pope John Paul wrote 100 years after Rerum Novarum, but then speaking of issues of the day as well as the principles that were presented by Pope Leo XIII. Then also on evangelization, on social concern, Splendor of Truth, that John Paul wrote, Veritatis Splendor, more on the life issues, and also Evangelium Vitae. So you can see a variety of topics that are covered. And then third from the bottom on this list of papal documents. These are just papal and Vatican documents. Laudato Si is in there. So you can just see the continual teaching. So Pope Francis in this encyclical is part of a broader experience. It's historical. And that's just from the Vatican and the popes. Then there's the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have addressed very different issues. Climate change is part of that. Solidarity, labor issues, concern for the poor, racism. So there you can see a variety. The death penalty, a variety of topics. And that's just the United States. Then one of the things as you read through Laudato Si, he quotes teachings from various bishop conferences of all around the world and the way they have addressed issues of the environment. So I think it's just good to see a list like that and recognize this is a broad body of work, and it's a theology and a perspective of faith that is part of being Catholic. It's just part of being Catholic as we go forward. So that's where the American bishops then develop, just by saying, looking at this body of work, what are the principles that we draw from this that really they all have in common in some way, or themes that continually get addressed? And that's where we have what are referred to as the 7 themes of social justice. And this is not in the catechism per se, this is more work of the American bishops, and it's on their website. And in the American version of the catechism, they've done a little bit of their own editing, but not changing, again, any editing, any teaching, but just how it's presented. When the Universal Catechism was promulgated in, 92, 94, somewhere like that, it was meant to be a universal catechism, but then each country might adapt it for, particular language groups or issues, or how faith is approached in this or that part of the world. And then, of course, there's for little kids, it's still the foundational work, the catechism for little kids, for teenagers, for all the age groups, for adults. So this is the source of a compendium of Catholic thought, and then you use that for other catechisms for different circumstances. But among those, they also articulate, what do we believe about this Catholic social doctrine? And those themes are, the life and dignity of the human person, all the life issues that we talk about, but it's broader than just, say abortion or death penalty or euthanasia. The call to family and community. We need to build a society that's healthy for families, for community, for a sense of healthy growth societally. Then there are fundamental human rights and responsibilities. So the rights don't just come as I have all these rights, but also if I live in this world, I have a responsibility to protect the rights of others and to contribute in some way to society. We're not here to just absorb and consume, but to give back. Then the option for the poor and vulnerable. That's, they often quote Matthew 25. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When did I see you hungry and feed you? Well, whatever you did for these who were hurting most, you did it for me. Furthermore, if you continue with that section, and whatever you fail to do for them, you're failing me. That's the part that people don't want to read as much, because we can all see, wow, I know I could have done more, sins of omission. But we have, that's the option for the poor. And recognizing that, the poor need a break because they need it more. I mean, if you have a house and savings and a retirement plan, you're okay. And somebody who doesn't know where the next meal is, they need more help. So we should put energy there rather than make sure that everybody who already is established has more. Those who don't have anything, how do we help them out? And that's our fundamental responsibility. Of course, Jesus preached a lot of that, to care for the poor. He didn't say the poor will always be with you, but that wasn't, so do whatever you want. It was sort of like, well, it's just the way the world is. It wasn't that kind of dismissive, cynical approach. It was saying they are here, but put Christ first, and then he'll teach us how to love those who are poor, the least of his brothers and sisters. And then dignity and rights of workers. Rerum Novarum on the industrial age was concerned about a lot of that. Solidarity, recognizing we're all in this together. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is famous for his quote, if anyone is enslaved, we're all enslaved. Nobody's completely free until everyone's free, because we are meant to be a society that really cares about each other. And this shouldn't just be that I have these rights because I'm an American. It should be, these are human rights that are good for everyone, and everyone has a fundamental right to, that are God-given rights. And then lastly on this list is caring for God's creation. So Pope Francis is not the only one writing about the environment, but he gave it attention in a significant style of teaching, which is the Encyclical. But as you mentioned, Laudato Si, I think it's important for us to know even local regions of bishops, like the bishops of the Columbia River Basin, wrote this document some years ago, 2001, on the Columbia River watershed and what's the responsibility in this region of the world toward our part of the planet that we're called to care for. And do we enact laws and practices that help to make sure that it's a sustainable plan for the good of creation, which is for the good of humanity, which you'll get into. Now, I also want to get into some reasons why this particular encyclical was written. Before I do that, any questions just on the broader sense of Catholic social doctrine, or we've been going on here for a while? Feel free to raise your hand if there's some opportunity of clarification. But I just want to place this encyclical in the context of proclaiming the gospel, and then this is part of it is the social health, a healthy societal expression and right relationship. So the key reasons for writing this encyclical, Laudato Si, is there's a great quote from the New York Times around that time. On the day it was published, the Pope privately told his closest advisors in Rome that the encyclical was not really just about the environment. And I think that's an important thing to draw from this. Yes, it is, but it's also, global warming is merely a symptom of a deeper malaise. The issues of climate change, that might be an issue of the day or the pressure of the moment, but it's to try to teach principles that either could have helped us avoid this, or going forward, how do we live? But it's more about human interactions. The real problem, he insists, this middle paragraph, is the myopic mentality that has failed to address climate change to date. And really the issue is the wealth, the rich world's indifference to the despoilation of the environment in pursuit of short-term economic gain is rooted in a wider problem. Market economics has taught us that the world is a resource to be manipulated for our gain. And as you'll hear when we get into the encyclical, a lot of it is recognizing we're part of all of creation. So we're meant to be in relationship with creation. So we don't want to exploit creation. We utilize the gifts that God's given us through creation, but in such a way that we're not destroying it along the way. There are ways to do that. And those are the principles that the Pope wants to get across. But when you see some problems happening, a simple one would be like, if you have certain chemicals that are used in farming that end up destroying other crops, it actually ends up limiting the rich diversity of life and growth and farming and what can be available for consumers and for your table. One of those, I don't have the facts of the details of it, but just how many species of apples there used to be. And then market forces have led it to just diminish dramatically the different species of apples. They're just extinct, never to return. And sometimes people are caretakers of that kind of work. They try to preserve given trees and make sure that they grow in certain regions. But animals have become extinct. That's another kind of issue of sometimes it has to do with economic purposes that go awry and aren't able to sustain all those things that were here at one time that no longer are. What's our responsibility in that? And then he also continues, this also leads to unjust and exploitative economic systems that support what Francis calls the throwaway culture. You hear that a lot from him. But just recognizing that, we should find ways to reuse things. And it's not just to be, paper straws instead of plastic, that's a tiny little thing, but just recognizing how do we sustain a plan? We think of that economically. If you want to add something to your business, you say, well, can we sustain this? Are we going to have enough income so that this will be long term, or is it just a one-time deal? Or is it going to be so expensive it could ruin our business? You think, what's a sustainable economic plan to keep, if this is an important thing to add to our business and our purpose of what we create? Well, so it is caring for the planet. How do we sustain it? And when he talks about throwaway culture, it's not just these global issues of the environment and that concept of nature, but also unwanted people, the poor, the elderly, the unborn. Yes, John?
So it's kind of a trope in our culture that a lot of what we consider, say, market or capitalist ethics comes from, particularly from Protestantism, and this kind of notion that the Bible says God gave us dominion over the earth.
Oh, I'll get into that. That word dominion, we'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay, I was just wondering if we covered that.
Yeah, no, we will. And that's an understanding of what dominion means in Genesis. So hold tight. Thank you for bringing that up. So that notion of what's our responsibility, when we think of personal morality, it helps us understand something of a broader of the broader concept of social morality. So there's a great definition of sin on the top of page 5. It's from St. Basil the Great, a monk in the 4th century. He said, here's the definition of sin. I love this definition of sin because it just makes it so clear. Sin is the misuse of powers, or I would say gifts, given us by God for doing good. The use contrary to God's commandments. So, sexual sin that is contrary to marriage, outside of marriage, or extramarital. Okay, sexuality is a gift, but it's a misuse of that gift. On the other hand, virtue is that God asks us to use the same powers based on good conscience in accordance with God's commands. The unitive quality of matrimony and the sexual expression of love, and also the capacity for life to come forth from that love. That's using God's gifts the way they were called to be, and so that's a virtuous thing. So when people say church is against sex, no, we're not against sex. What we're against is misuse of the gift of sexuality, and for the proper virtuous use of sexuality for committed love, lifelong love, vowed love, and life. So when we, so I think when we think of this, how we understand social justice, those are good principles. What's going to be the proper use of the gifts God gives us? What are the detrimental uses of those gifts? Now, encyclical, we keep using that word, is just a letter. It's a fancy word for a letter, and but it's a letter. An encyclical is a papal document that's written to the whole world, and it's like a teaching, an established teaching for a long period of time, and sometimes addressing a particular issue, but it's for the global church. And this particular one they're titled usually by the very first line of the encyclical. And this one, Pope Francis is quoting Saint Francis, who was, you may not know this, but when you look at the history of the Italian language and poetry, the first poet in the history of Italian poetry that they have is 1200s, Saint Francis. He's considered sort of a first prominent poet because of him. He did write extensively, and we have an example of some of that here in a second. But they take the first line. He used an Italian poet, and so he used the Italian expression that is translated in every language group that reads this encyclical, they have the words Laudato Si, which is praise be. Laudato Si mi Signore, praise be my Lord, mi Signore. And then it's mostly written in Latin and then translated into everything else. But he's quoting an Italian poet and saint. So, but the title is that, praise be to you, because that's the very first line. Laudato Si, praise to you. And then on the care of our common home is sort of a subtitle. And you'll see an addendum too, and it's the very, very last page of this, is the actual Canticle of the Sun. It is St. Francis' poem from the 13th century, describing the beauty of God's creation and how we are called to be in relationship with it in some way. So things, gifts of nature are referred to as brother and sister. See at the beginning, that second stanza, praise be my Lord with all the creatures, and especially our brother the sun, which brings us the day and the light. Fair is he, and shining with very great splendor. O Lord, he signifies you to us. Like God's love is warming our hearts as the sun warms the earth. And then Sister Moon, and so there's this relational nature. Even toward the end of his life, just before he died, he told his the other brothers, I get my pen, because he had more to add, because he sees his own life going, and he needs to come to terms with death. Death is part of nature, and he says, and praise be to you for sister death. The death of the body, which no one can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. We don't want to die a spiritual death, but embrace the physical death, knowing that it leads to eternal life. So there's the sense of relationship we're called to, and that's what Pope Francis wanted to get across. That's why he uses that as sort of a poetic expression of what this document's about. Now, I also like to say something about and then we'll get into the encyclical itself. Say something about the urgency. And this is how I'm understanding this encyclical. There's something that pushes an urgency of the matter, climate change issues, and people can have a lot of difference of opinions about that. But the point I want to get across even more is this should be a normative way of acting. What he's trying to teach us, whether there was an urgency or not, this should be the way we treat the planet we live on, we're a part of, is with the sense of care and concern and not exploiting and treating things in sustainable ways, because that should be just the way we live and treat the gifts that God gave us by not destroying them. And so an analogy I use is we should take care of our teeth. It's good to brush your teeth and floss, and that's not just for the health of your teeth. It impacts a lot of other things in your body, because if your tooth is in agony, then you don't want to eat because it's too painful, and then you're not getting the proper nutrition, and that impacts other systems in your body. Okay. But what happens is lots of times somebody doesn't care for their teeth, or they never learn about the importance of that. It's not integrated in their life. Then after a while, their teeth might start to rot. They never have a chance, or don't have the resources to get regular checkups, don't have a health plan. Then they have a crisis where your tooth has to be pulled. They're laughing because John just had a major tooth issue.
Or you shoot your tooth out with the BB gun.
Yeah. So, I didn't think of this. I didn't know about that. But the crisis is, I'm going to lose my tooth because it's rotten, because I never cared for it, and it's causing all these other problems in my physical health, and that impacts my emotional health, my capacity to work, economic health. And it all has to do with the teeth, and if I had cared for them in the first place, not just when there's a crisis, that helps. So got to fix the crisis, but also develop a pattern of caring for my teeth for the long haul, for long haul health in all these areas, economic, physical, emotional. Because if we don't do it, it impacts all those things negatively. Well, so it is when we think of the environment. Climate change, and some of the issues we're facing there, and I'm not an expert in all of those things. It can be kind of like a rabbit hole. You can keep, the more you read about it, the more depressing you can get. The more depressed you can get. But it's an urgency that makes us think, that reminds us we should be living in a healthy, sustainable way in relationship with our planet anyway. And that's, I think, a lot of what Pope Francis is going to try to deliver to us in this encyclical. Yeah, he addresses issues of the day, but he also talks about how should we understand this gift that God has given to us, for the long haul. So yes, times are desperate, but it's stating a broader principle, just like all the other things. The thing about workers at Rerum Novarum, dealing with that. We realized if we're left to our unchecked, to our own devices, we may not care for the lowest paid employees, and they can be harmed and abandoned and overworked, exploited. But when we, creates a more just society, now, things can go up and down, but it's trying to make sure that there's a balance in everyone having a chance to, further their lives and have basic rights respected. So now, before we go into the next section, and we will get to dominion in a second, John. But anything? Anybody need a chance for a break or use the restroom, or you want to continue on?
How do you separate when you think of the poor?
Mm-hmm.
We drive by people that are begging, and that's their job. They work. They're there every day. They pay the bills with that. How do you separate those people from the woman who has been left abandoned with 2 children?
Well, to some degree, everybody has their own story. If I always think, because I've thought that too, but I always think if somebody is, if I see them at the freeway exit every single day, it's easy to think that's a job, but what kind of job is that? I mean, is it, what else is lacking in their life that keeps them from being able to have a real sustainable plan for livelihood? Or they may not know about resources that are available to them. They may be struggling from some other mental health issue. I can't see that. I can't tell that at all by seeing them there even every single day. There's some people that we've helped who actually are, genius level mathematicians, but are just lacking in the capacity. Published authors, but ran into some mental health crises, didn't have the resources, other things happened in their life. And one of those is somebody, our own St. Vincent de Paul has helped, who finally got in touch where he could have some consistency of a mailing address, and then a mailing address meant he had benefits that he could finally get, then he could get into housing and all that stuff. But you wouldn't have thought that if you just saw him on the street every day in the same place. There's not everybody has his story, but everybody has a story, and so part of that is just listening and starting to know the story. Pope Francis also writes a lot about accompaniment, which is consistent with other popes and teachings, but just walking along with people, taking the time to hear why they're in that circumstance, and then see that there's more to it. It's easier from the outside to misunderstand all the motives and what led to this or that. I've been amazed when I chat with people who are at, standing in line for food or something, and I'm just out there to be friendly, and then find out, where are you from, and what brought you here, and then finding out their story is actually fascinating, sometimes quite intriguing, but sometimes horribly tragic. And wow, any of us could be in that position with those circumstances. Yeah. So I think you have to hear their story. So let's look at the encyclical itself. In the introduction, again, he starts with that notion of relational, quoting St. Francis. Pope Francis quotes St. Francis' poem, and then talks about the relationship we have with Sister earth, or that sense of the mother earth. It's kind of a mixed metaphor here. But he says that this sister earth now cries out because of the harm we have inflicted on her by irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. Misuse of the gifts that God has given us. As I mentioned, that way St. Basil the Great describes sin. And we've come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, but that's not our role. If refer to earth as like sister earth or some kind of positive relational notion, then you don't think of I have control and domination over the earth. It's no, we're in relationship. You be good to the earth and it'll be good to you, kind of thing. But it's a consciousness that he's trying to raise in that relational nature. So that's one way to understand this is relationally. I think there's a lot of ways in which we can understand, and Pope Francis tries to lay out how we understand that relationship or how we describe it. Even using the word relationship is one connotation or one metaphor. And then after this introduction, he gets into the reasons we need to focus. This is the urgency of it, and then he describes that notion of the throwaway culture, how there's not that reverence and respect for persons or for things or aspects of creation, how we exploit things, and the climate change that we're facing, the industrial system, its cycle of. This is a key point. Our industrial system, bottom of page 5, the last 2 lines. At the end of its cycle of production and consumption, has not developed the capacity to absorb and use waste and the byproducts. We have not yet managed to adopt a circular model of production capable of preserving resources for present and future generations, while limiting as much as possible the use of non-renewable resources, moderating their consumption, maximizing their efficient use, reusing and recycling. It's just that notion of if you can overfish an area, and then what's that do for the livelihood, of that area? So that's why, even for people who are just anglers, fish recreationally, they have a limit so that you don't destroy the opportunity to catch fish for years down the road, or you can overuse the forest, and if they don't replenish and have new growth, then are you prepared for situations like forest fires? I was driving back down the gorge today, and you see that whole section where these spindly trees that were burned up. What's going to happen to those? They're not harvestable for building. But hopefully there's enough other forestation that we can sustain. So when a cataclysm happens like that, then we can replant that area eventually, and you want to have a sustainable practice so that we have forests for the long haul. Or the same with, lots of other, and what's another one I was thinking of? Forestry, fishing, the rainforest, and how much that contributes to the process of, what's the word I'm looking for? You all know it. It's photosynthesis. Yeah, so they produce oxygen. The more of the rainforest that goes away, we would start reducing the use of oxygen. What would be a more sustainable way? And you have to set limits on that. And so anglers know, Fish and Game says you can only catch 1 salmon or 6 trout or whatever the number might be that season or that period of time, so that I can go fishing next year too, or tomorrow even. You don't want to overdo it. So, you might not like it. Some people of ill will might even try to cheat the system, and hide the extra fish they catch. We all say that's wrong. You should follow rules. There are laws to control that so that we can preserve the gift. And we gladly recognize the authority. That's, remember that comment about a part of a healthy society is you have an authority that we all respect and recognize, and that's also helps us, and United States, we'd like to say we're all, in a sense, the authority. If we're all voters, we're a nation of the people, by the people. And so we voted those people into position or those laws into place, or our representatives did. So how do we sustain things that's one of the notions here, and when it's not done, it causes a lot of harm. And then he lists a number of those. And this is going to be very brief on the section that really deserves a lot more time. But our resources are finite. This is also on page 6. And we're not cooperating with creation's order. Creation's order is, if you cut down a tree, are you going to replant another tree? If you harvest the farm crop, are you preserving the land there so that you can grow another crop or rotate crops so you don't overuse the farmers who want to make a living and do it for a long time. They get this stuff. They know the importance of that. Cattle ranchers too. I worked on a cattle ranch for a while, and I thought, wow, these are very environmentally conscious people because they don't want to overgraze an area because they want to be able to graze there next year too. So our resources are finite. We have to cooperate with that natural order, creation's order. And Pope Francis emphasizes that the climate itself is a common good. I'll get into a little bit more about what common good means because that's a very important principle in Catholic social teaching. But Pope Francis emphasizes or as a catechism, well, here it is, as a catechism explains, by common good we understand the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach fulfillment more fully and more easily. So, for instance, a common good might be for, as best we can, for everyone to be employed. If they're able to work, and if they're not able to, people who get involved in working with folks who are homeless, like this group called Rob Justice started it. Join. Yeah, he and his organization would go out, get to know those who are living under the bridges, find out what their issues were, get to hear their story, and then help them find a way to. What are the obstacles for them to get into proper housing? Because if you can get into proper housing, then you can start having a mailing address, start getting benefits, have access to the Oregon Health Plan, to food stamp, and then maybe some housing that'll sustain you for a while. Then you're healthier. You can go out and get a job and find a job that you're able to do, or if they need to be on disability, find the access to disability, and then get out of the cycle of homelessness and into a temporary housing, and then eventually permanent housing, and that's the common good. Everybody should have housing, right? But sometimes, some don't have access to that for a variety of reasons. So how do we create a more common good? How do we honor the common good by trying to create that sense of everyone should have a proper home? So that's a notion of, those are examples of the common good. So when we want to be, what's good for society, some principles that we should all be able to hope for. And when you see a large swath of the population denied some basic rights, then what do we need to do to create that more just circumstance? And the Catechism explains common good that way. And then Pope Francis focuses on the Catechism. I just tucked in there so you know what the word common good, have a better sense of the word common good, the term. But he describes several matters of urgency in climate change and lack of access to safe water for many. You think of all those parts of Sudan or something where people don't have access to water, or desert areas or drought areas. Loss of biodiversity, as I mentioned, the apples. The fewer and fewer species of apples. Decline of cities, we can see that happening here in our own country. And sometimes that has to do with economic pressures, but also environmental issues. Undue burden that causes the poor, saying that both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. For instance, sometimes how crops are done and how workers can be exploited, farmers. And where it's a crop that doesn't sustain or allow for a healthier mix and biodiversity in a given area. I know Hawaii is struggling with some of these things. You can actually destroy the chance for long-term jobs and meaningful work. So the poor struggle with those things. Or another one, and he gets into this in other areas of this encyclical, the wealthier nations who have greater industry and might be exploiting more of the planet have a chance to, we have the capacity to maybe pay for our things, but the poorer countries don't have the infrastructure to solve the environmental problems in their area. Should the wealthier nations have a responsibility, because these issues are global, to help poorer nations in their plight and environmental concerns or degradation. So those, because they do struggle a lot more. And some of these systems are complex. I know for myself, even reading this and thinking about the issues, my brain hurts more and more, because it's just so complex. But if we have these principles of a common good and people have a right to health and safety and solidarity is one of the principles of social justice. If poor nations are struggling, then it's us. That's us. We're part of that. We're in relationship with them. We're all God's children. So, what is our level of responsibility? And we still provide for ourselves. But here's the meat of, or some of the key points of why this is important, and that's the second section on the gospel of creation, or why we should live the way, what's a better way of living? How should we understand what the gift of the earth is for us, or our planet or nature, other species who share this earth with us? And that's where he gets into the balance of science and faith and how they work together. That's one of the misunderstandings, I think, in our secular culture right now is they think religion is one thing, science is another. I believe in science, so religion is just all people trying to figure it out because they're not smart enough to understand science. That it's so insulting when I hear those kind of things. But actually, they work together. But what our faith helps us understand is our Creator and how we're meant to be in relationship. The why, the meaning of things, and science is just another language that helps us understand how things work. So I often think of that as science is for the sake of what things are and how they might function, but the faith is about meaning and why things are important. The why we are, why God is, how we're called to be in relationship. So the principles, a sense of meaning. But science, I just think of it as another language to describe creation. And so is philosophy, and so is poetry, and so is theology, and the language of our faith. So they should work together, but the science, I think, the faith, the perspective of faith is understanding the Creator's plan and the purpose of creation. They work together. So that's where he wants to say, this is not just an issue of science and politics, it's also a matter of faith. What is the Creator's plan for our common home, and how are we called to be a part of that? And how are we called to contribute? And disregard for that duty is what leads to broken relationships. So this, in that second to last full paragraph, it says that disregard to the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor, or those whose care and custody I'm responsible for, ruins my relationship, even with myself, with others, with God, and with the earth. He's just trying to say, well, it's all interrelated. How I treat somebody at home, helps me. It has an impact more than just this one relationship. If that's injured, it starts to injure. It has a ripple effect that starts causing harm in other areas of our lives, and so it is with. When it comes to these environmental matters. So to ignore that notion of sin, and the broken relationship is part of the sin. If sin is something that harms our relationship with God or others, virtue is what's going to strengthen it. We can lose sight of what our purpose is and what the ultimate goal is of ourselves or our lives or all the gifts that God has given to us, including natural gifts that are in what we call nature. I say what we call nature because, as we're going to get into this a little bit, we're part of the nature. We often think of ourselves as different than nature. That's where it leads to a sense of domination over nature. Instead of saying, I'm part of this world that also trees exist in, and animals exist in, the oceans exist in. And some of the DNA is also integrated in all of us, So we need to recognize that we're part of that. We should have a sense of being in communion and not in domination. So this last two lines, it gets to what John brought up earlier. This helps us better understand the admonition that is given in 1 Genesis, that humans have dominion over creation. It's not having to do with, it has more to do with being in communion with the rest of creation, and sometimes being a caretaker for aspects of creation. And a steward is a gift that I want to care for and honor and respect, but it's not meant to be domination. And Pope Francis in several ways is going to describe that, how we're not here to dominate or exploit, but to recognize how we're called to be in relationship with the beauty and wonder of God's gift of creation. And so then he gets into the human roots of the actual ecological crisis, where we have sinned in that regard, where we have failed to have a proper relationship and cause that leads to environmental issues. And it's again an image that I like to use here is what is consistent with Ignatian spirituality. St. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, he also had a spirituality, the spiritual exercises, which help to understand how we're meant to be in right relationship with God and with each other. And I would say also with all of creation. And the way he describes it, this is a fundamental purpose and intention of Ignatian spirituality, is the things that are going to be valuable in our lives are things that help lead us to the Creator, lead us to God, lead us to right relationship with God, and by extension with other people and with all of God's creation. So when we think or judging something, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Is it going to help me be stronger in my relationship with God, or is it going to hurt my relationship with God? And the things that hurt my relationship with God or others, which essentially is hurting my relationship with God, or exploiting God's gift of nature and hurting my relationship with God, then I want to detach. I need to separate from that. It's not helpful for me. It might be an attitude. It might be an addiction. It might be a personal desire or a appetite, but it's not really healthy for me, So where do we limit things? And because they will draw me away from God, draw me away from other people in a healthy relationship, or draw me away from a healthy relationship with others, or harm my relationship with creation, but fundamentally all of that harms my relationship with God. So I want to detach from things, attitudes that separate me from God and others, and affirm those that lead me to God and others. That's the Ignatian spirituality. But I think that's it. Pope Francis, was a Jesuit. He lived that for his entire life before he became a bishop, and still integrates it. I think that's underlying some of this is what when we recognize the human roots of the ecological crisis. What are the things that we become too attached to that we end up exploiting them? We're seeing, fossil fuels are all being, you're going to come to an end after a while because they're not sustainable. We're not producing fossil fuels more every day. They are there, and then when they're not gone, they're done. Or other species of animals or plants or tribes, cultures that become extinct. Those are harmful. So how do we detach from those things that might cause harm there? The rainforest is another example. We don't want to overuse that so that it no longer can produce the oxygen we need. Rather, we should move to a truer notion of our relationship with the environment that can never be isolated from our relationship with others and God. So that's, again, he's using that in relational language. In other words, and this is the last bit of section 3 there, in other words, to care for the earth and advocate for a more sustainable environment is akin to exercising service and love of God and others. I think that's important when we think about this. It's really an expression of our faith and our relationship with God. How I treat the planet, even a simple gesture that's, it's not going to make it in the papers, it's not going to do anything, but picking up garbage when I'm walking down the street and I see it and there's a garbage can at the end of the block. It's a simple thing, but it's recognizing I've got a responsibility here, like everyone. Well, how do we do that on a larger scale? And that's where he gets into this last bit on integral ecology. Any questions before I launch into that? Yes.
I do want to say that he wrote this in, I believe it was 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And I think a lot of these points came to the forefront during COVID, because during COVID, we were all sequestered.
Yeah.
And all of the changes that showed immediately when people stopped commuting. I mean, when we had all of a sudden things growing,
That's
animals
true.
walking around downtown, and the air in India cleaned up,
And China. And
yes, I mean, it's
here,
total validation of what he's saying.
I was in Hawaii in January, and I was talking to some of those folks about what it was like in COVID what it was like in Hawaii during COVID, which is, huge tourist industry, right? But nobody could travel there. Nobody go on planes. What they said is the animals came back. The beaches were no longer filled with people laying out there with too much sunscreen on or suntan lotion or whatever and pina coladas, but there were all these animals who also like to be on the beaches who would come up. The tropical fish came back in remarkable ways. They said it was really something. People who grew up in Hawaii never saw some of those things. And they said the animals all came back. That's how they kept saying it. And you can also see they have Hawaii, because it's an island, they have a sense of preservation that I think island cultures pick up a little bit more. One of them, for instance, is I went snorkeling in Hanauma Bay, which is a coral reef on Oahu. But you can't go on Monday and Tuesday. It's closed on Monday and Tuesday for the fish to come back. If the people are swimming around there like I was, it's great, it's beautiful, and I have a much greater appreciation for tropical reefs and all that stuff. And it's great for me, but I couldn't go on Monday or Tuesday, so that it was great for the fish. So they get rid of people like me for a while, so they can just enjoy their habitat, and be there for somebody else to explore and be filled with wonder about them. Another thing that's part of Hawaii culture is, when we looked at they have a museum there, the Bishop's Museum, about the royalty of the Hawaiian people, the kings and the queens. They have these feather things that they, it's not like a peacock, fan, but it's just these feathers that are all bunched together from birds that are very colorful from these birds' feathers. But when they were made, even in earlier times, 1800s, they didn't capture the bird and then kill it and pluck all the feathers off. Like, I think most of us would think that's how you get those feathers. No, they would capture the birds, take only a few feathers, but would not harm their ability to fly and get away from predators. And then just use the feathers, and it takes a lot longer to harvest feathers that way, but you're going to keep the birds around. I thought, wow, what's amazing to think that way. But it takes a lot of effort and time, but then they treasure those gifts, and they're still in museums to be preserved. But they didn't kill the birds. They exploited the birds to some degree. But their feathers could grow back, and they could keep flying. Did you have a comment? Okay. So anyway, Hawaii has a strong sense of recognizing what this section is, integral ecology. Pope Francis suggests a perspective which can guide us when we're looking for a solution. And this is on page 7, the section Roman numeral 4. Second sentence there is, it cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. This is important. One of the ways we think of this in a negative way is how they find pollutants that exist in Europe or in the blood of polar bears who've never been to Europe. It's just because it gets into the water and fish absorbs that, and that fish is eaten by a seal, and that seal is eaten by polar bears. It's migrating further north, and after a while, polar bears have stuff in their system, chemicals in their system, that are nowhere near the Arctic.
I think they're finding we even in ours.
Yeah.
It's showing up that we have plastics. And
Yeah.
in
Exactly. So it's just that's a negative, a via negativa of seeing that everything is interconnected. But positively, it's also, this continues, this sentence. Time and space are not independent of one another. Time and space, too, usually those are more philosophical or theological concepts. But they're not independent of each other. And not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore and understand. It's too broad and complex. A good part of our genetic code is shared by many living things that are not even remotely human, but are part. We're all part of each other, and I think this is a great way to think of it. We've just described how that negatively can happen, but what are the positive aspects of that? And when you start to think that way, then you have a greater sense of responsibility toward those other species that share some of my genetic code, where we are, it's not something I want to exploit, but come to understand and be in relationship with. That's a gift of God's creation. And so it's just divesting ourselves of a notion of being outside the realm of nature. I think growing up most of the time, I just thought, well, there's nature, and then there's my life. And I'm a human being, and I live in a city with concrete and formica, or whatever it is, some synthetic things. And then you go camping in nature, but then you come home. You go to the Oregon coast, and that's nature, but then you come home. Well, no, my home is part of nature. My body is part of nature. We're all part. It shouldn't be a dichotomy, us and them kind of thing. And I think that's the integral theology or ecology that Pope Francis is talking about, which I think is an important, probably one of the biggest takeaways or most important takeaways of this document. And so he says that nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction in it. Therefore, solutions for the environment have to be also, they're going to help for the betterment of human relationships too. We're part of it. It's good for the seal is also good for me. It's good for the polar bear, or the rainforest is also good for me. And so I think that's an important notion to capture, and we want to embrace that. It's changing the way we look at things. I think that's the gift of this encyclical, because when we start looking at it differently, then we realize I need to pay more attention to this, because it's part of me. It's a part of myself that I've been ignoring or haven't been given a proper attention. And in fact, here's a quote from Pope Benedict. Benedict also wrote about these matters, as did John Paul. Every violation of solidarity with this broader sense of nature and civic friendship harms the environment. So it's just again reaffirming that when we harm any aspect of our lives or our relationship, it also has an impact on all this interconnectedness. And so it's a matter of creating not just laws, but more an attitude. Here I'd like to, in fact, let me see, it's a second full or third full paragraph. But to change for the better, it cannot always be just about laws. Can we hope then that in such cases, legislation and regulations dealing with the environment will really be effective? People can break laws or argue about laws or vote laws in and out. We know, for example, that countries that have clear legislation about protection of forests continue to keep silence as they watch laws repeatedly broken. Or poachers, who go into areas and exploit animals, like the trade, what are they? Rhinoceros tusk. or whaling, or all of those things. We can see you can exploit something and cause a lot of harm. You can have laws, but every law can be broken. Is it enough just to make laws? And this reminds me of another serious issue that we face in our world, the issue of respect for life and abortion. There's a quote from Abby Johnson, which I think is applied. She was a very strong pro-life advocate. She used to run abortion clinics for Planned Parenthood until she assisted with an abortion and saw as the syringe was inserted into the womb to suck the baby out. When she was watching an ultrasound and it touched the child's leg and it winced in pain to get away. And it's a human being. I mean, it's like it just came clear to her, what are we doing? And that kind of turned the corner. Yeah, she gave a talk here
She
once.
was amazing.
Yeah, she really is remarkable.
She changed my life by thinking this.
But I like her approach to this too, because right now we're heckling about all this kind of laws on abortion. I'm only using this mainly to jump off to how we should understand environmental laws. She says the goal is not to make abortion illegal, but unthinkable. She's saying we should create a society where people say, I wouldn't even consider that, because our society has come to respect all the complexity and mix of life, including life in the womb, and so that we don't need a law. I mean, the law is just to kind of state the common belief that life is from a conception till natural death. And so if we, changing hearts, that is, not just by forcing people to comply, but changing a heart that, they get it, that this is a life to be protected. So should it be about the environment? We shouldn't just have laws to protect the environment that are just forcing us into compliance, but that we get the why we need to do that. And so it's a good law, and I want to respect that law, and I want to help implement that. When you see somebody throwing stuff out the window, garbage on the side of the road, you say, hey, don't do that. Let me, you stop and pick it up, or if it's a family member or a friend, you say, we should be a little more careful. And so you're not just littering as illegal, right? But we should try to get it to where you want to keep things clean, and you want to help clean areas up. And those are just local issues, but even a broader global.
I just kind of wanted to punctuate what you said there very quickly, because I believe that to a certain extent, I've worked for 40 years as a wetlands biologist, and wetlands is a key area where people started to get it. The reason why you have to preserve wetlands and what functions and values they offer in the greater scheme of the environment. But if we could do that, bring it to heart and see, connect with. I think it could work for almost every element of the environment and for individuals. So you're right. I just wanted to punctuate.
Right. Thank you. And I think then when it grabs your heart, then you say, well, what else is going on? I need to be aware of this. And then you're hungry to learn more about the issues. And then what are better ways to go about that and be part of that work, at least locally, if not globally?
Europe is a lot further ahead in this regard than we are. And I have to wonder if we aren't bipolar in our political right now.
Well,
Trump first to this, and
red and blue and all that.
Yeah, and what's so striking is that some people are not admitting that we have a problem.
Right. Well, that's it. A lot of it is admitting
There's a lot
that
of
there's a
confusion in
problem.
the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, America has been so strong because our rule of law has been very fundamental and solid.
Right.
But
law gets. Laws help in a lot of respect, just to, and you have to have a way of enforcing them. But wouldn't it be better if we just if we embrace those, because they're good, like for good traffic patterns. I know a guy who used to complain about people were parking the wrong way on a street. It's a narrow neighborhood street, and so they're on the right lane, but there's more parking on the left side of the street, even though it's oncoming traffic, but there's nobody coming. So they point in the other direction on the other side of the street because there's a spot. This guy used to drive him crazy. But he says they're disrespecting the law and the principle and the direction of things. It's unsafe, and I go, well, you got a good point. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna kind of comment that, it seems to me sometimes that when I get frustrated about all this kind of stuff, that, we used to have more of a sense of community and community responsibility. And it seems like now society has more of a what's in it for me.
Yeah.
Or I always talk about that radio station they're listening to, WIFM, what's in it for me, and kind of thing, And when you have that and everything is, well, I got mine, too bad for everybody else.
Right.
We don't seem to have that as a culture all around, and whether it's like you're saying, we don't have as many people coming to church, we don't have a way to share that common value so much anymore, and look where we are.
Well, but the solution of that is acknowledging that that's not a way I want to live, so I try to live by a different way and then be an example for others. And it doesn't mean we just do it while we're at church, we do it in other places, because there's this principle of solidarity, that we're all interconnected, and I can't just think what's in it for me. If that's going to make what's in it for somebody else, they'll have loss, great sense of loss. So how do I, by being an example, and also sometimes you have to have laws to make sure you protect those things, because not everyone's going to get it. But wouldn't it be great if and this is, I think, the value of living the Christian life in an exemplary way. That's part of evangelizing, is it gets these principles that apply also to environmental issues as well as just, personal ethics. Yeah.
So 25 years ago, I was a student in environmental studies, was what I majored in, and so I was like living it, and you just were swimming upstream, and nobody cared.
Right.
And here I would just be sitting there like, oh, I'm doing all these environmental things, and just the world around you didn't care. And
That's frustrating.
Global warming was an issue 25 years
Sure.
ago, which I was aware of.
Yeah.
And now everybody's like, oh my God, the sky is falling.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, of course it is. Like 25 years ago,
Exactly.
we've been doing something about it. And I find the whole thing frustrating, and I kind of turned away from it because it just seems so hopeless in a way, and which is why I'm here, is to try to find hope in it again.
Yeah.
But poverty is a huge issue. Nobody's going to care about the wetlands if they don't have anything they can.
Right.
How are they going to get their kids fed? And the consumerism, again, just touching on your issue, it's like, what am I going to get? It's like, I don't even know how you break the cycle until we're forced to, because humans can't, for some reason, we can't see, 25 years ago, we couldn't see where we'd be today, even though they were saying we're going to be here.
Right.
We're more of it's an emergency, do something now about it. So how do we collectively decide, we're going to put the brakes on? And then just, this is why it's such a frustrating, they get to see everything. You see the poverty in the developing countries, we're going to tell them, no, you can't achieve what we've had. And there's a lot of people that live in India,
Right.
in Indonesia. So they are to get to where we are comfortably, who are we to say that they can't have those things, right? We would have to go back a lot. And who wants to do that? Who wants to give up the countries that have, So it's just where does it end? It's just kind of it's overflowing and overwhelming.
No, and it can, you're right. And this has been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And I, to some degree, I also think, well, and so has sin been in the world for a long time. And so much. But, families destroyed and addiction. But I think what Pope Francis is kind of preaching here is the gospel of make sure that we understand, if we're going to embrace Christ and the call to proclaim that hope, it also has to do with how we understand our relationship as a part of nature, so some of it is like our ongoing conversion. You two are poster children of that. We're ongoing growing in faith, returning, deepening our faith, becoming more conscious. Hopefully that's what's going to motivate us. In fact, even from this talk today, I'd hope that, some might say, okay, how can we broaden this understanding? Maybe we should, develop some study groups around this going forward. We're having kind of Catholic Social Action Committee that just started up, and how can we broaden those interests? And we can only do what we can do, but it's better than not doing anything, like that, But it's incredibly frustrating.
It's very frustrating because you feel like our economic the economics of this country has to just like, I'm not, capitalism, I understand has done great things for humanity, and I'm not bagging on it, but it's like the whole shift of the economy has to shift in order for the environment, I feel, to be drastically changed.
Well, that's like checks and balances, you know. Pope John Paul II used to refer to that as, you know, unbridled capitalism is really no less evil than unbridled communism. You know, when you deny all rights, or that just the focused on
Hedonist.
yeah, either hedonist or I can't remember what the word, but profit, just run amok. If that's the only principle you're guided by,
Right.
that's as dangerous as.
Right. Usually B corporations are great, you know, because they have just not just the bottom line, it's how are you helping your community, how are you helping your employees, how are you helping the environment. You know, so we can kind of, that's starting to shift a bit. So
Right, there's some.
They're not a positive, you guys.
Well, there's some, yeah, and there are also some business plans that are conscious of what are we giving back or mitigating, you know, like even LEED building, LEED building, or you build in such a way that you're not, this building is LEED silver, I think, not gold, but.
I was thinking about the COVID, and to me, the COVID kind of acted as a tipping point. I mean, not only was COVID a wonderful time in that we avoided the Spanish flu ramifications. We lost millions of people, but we didn't lose billions of people.
Yeah.
But we also became very angry as a society, and very dysfunctional, and again, that bipolar politics that we're seeing now.
Yeah, even trying to bridge
Anger.
those things. Try to find some common ground that's kind of like common good, so try to recognize what we both benefit from. In fact, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is the next section, is lines of approach and action. He mentions a number of efforts that have been done, and I enumerate just 5 principles that were established at this one conference in 1992, which was also echoed efforts in 1972, and these agreements have been made at international levels, and then they're abandoned or not followed, or there's no way to put teeth into any kind of enforcement. And it leads to this quote that on page 9, and this is Pope Francis quoting Pope Benedict XVI. So a lot of times people think that, Pope Francis, he's that progressive Pope, and Benedict was, wow, he was a lot more orthodox. Which actually neither of those are true. They were both part of the rich tradition. But Benedict suggested this in the middle of the page there, to manage the global economy, to revive economies, this is Pope Benedict, that are hit by this crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and greater imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, you know, those are broader issues than just the environment, or food security and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment and regulate migration. For all of this, there is urgent need to be true to a world political authority, as Pope John the 23rd indicated some years ago, recognizing we need to recognize we're independent with each other, interdependent upon each other in a global way, that if every nation is thinking we're the best, it doesn't matter what anybody else does or thinks, it's to our own peril. Unless we say, what is common ground? I'm not going to win everything, or this is not always going to be to our greatest benefit, but maybe we're in a position to help somebody else in their greater benefit. John?
The phrase, a true world political authority.
Yeah.
Not to keep going on about the Protestants,
Mm-hmm.
but you can see how that phrase would drive them completely bonkers, especially with like the history that Protestants have about papists and
and he's not saying that the Pope should be the arbitrator in all those things.
no, but he is saying there is urgent need for some global order, and that's like that's insanity inducing to a lot of people here.
Sure, it can be, but we look at, say, our system of government in the United States. One of the things that I think is good about it, and it's really difficult to attain, and we see where it struggles, and it is struggling, is it just system of balances, so you have, three branches of government, and they should keep each other in check to some degree, and that happens in better and worse ways. And it's frustrating there, but shouldn't the international community have another similar kind of a thing, so we have checks and balances on each other, but we all have to agree to be part of the dialogue? The United Nations is an attempt to do that, but it's not the only way we can have international agreement. And that's what he's saying there. In fact, Pope Francis then in the middle paragraph there is aware that it's not his job to establish such an authority. And because that would infuriate the Protestants and the Muslims and the Jews and the Hindus and the atheists, and he's not saying that's my role. He's from one tradition trying to articulate these principles, some that are really universal. If you have some sense of creator, most people could read this if you're a theist of some kind and say, I want to honor the gift of the creator. And you don't have to be Catholic, obviously. So the church does not presume to settle scientific questions or to replace politics, but I'm concerned to encourage an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies will not prejudice the common good. So again, we're looking for the common good, but we don't want one perspective to dominate others. And sometimes by absenting ourselves, like if the United States stays out of some agreement, well, we're hurting the greater good. Now, we might want to, understandably, everybody has the right to negotiate, well, what's really fair for everybody, and then, okay, we can enter in. But always thinking what's good for the whole, not just for us. That's that notion of common good. Solidarity is also part of that. So that's why I think it's important to think of this Laudato Si in the context of this broader social teaching. Those principles are interrelated. So just again, we have to, the last section is ecological education and spirituality. We're doing a little bit of that here. We prayed, we're educating ourselves, we're talking about these issues, but I'd like to think this would be more of a genesis of something more that happens in our parish, and if it happens in our parish, maybe the diocese, and if it happens in the diocese, maybe broader. But we want to live that vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork, and recognize it's a vocation. I'm called to the ministry of priesthood, and I've known there's been from my beginning in the seminary, I knew there was a declining number of priests, and it was going in the wrong direction. And it still is, and there's some, there are ups and downs. It's not actually as bad as we thought at one time. But, I remember discerning that. Why would I want to go into a priesthood if it's all in decline? Because I had a kind of a narrow vision of the problem. And then I went, well, this is what God's calling me to do. And even if I'm the last one to shut the lights out, that's my God's call to me. And I don't think it's going to be shutting the lights out, but I think it's this particular period, and how am I part of what will be someday a resurgence, And because, I think you think of things that have really, like the American Disabilities Act. People lived in a lot of frustration as a disabled person for centuries, until finally we have something, a law, at least in this country and sometimes many other places, where we now say it's normative to any building that people should have access to a public building and be able to get everywhere, not just certain places. So I think that's what keeps me from being too frustrated, is knowing we've solved some problems. And so, we can look ahead with some hope, but we need to inform ourselves. And then I'm almost done here. And I think just on the back, I'll conclude with this. It's just that as we go forward, we do have to engage ourselves. Like I really appreciate your comment, Shari, because you're kind of saying I need to just get another boost of energy to keep going, because it can be so frustrating. It's paralyzing, but that can happen in a lot of aspects of life. And so that's why we need to. It's study. And it's our own personal conversion, the convictions of how I want to live and how I want our world to be. But then it's also prayer, recognizing it's bigger than just me. Not just prayer of intercession, though, prayer of being grounded in God, the Creator, And then that helps me be more respectful of all that God, the Creator, has created. But then action, what can I do? And I can't do everything, but I can do this, you know, and then, or I can be more aware and maybe help educate somebody else. You know, it's just so recognize our own personal call. What's my own personal call? And it's one of those things, if everybody does something, that's a greater solution. So any other comments before we close with a prayer?
One little quote,
yeah.
which I can't remember where I read it, but it said something like, "Our arms have gotten so long we don't know what our hands are doing anymore." And I really, the whole globalization idea, just reading about the cobalt mines, you know, and it's like, oh, let's go electric. That sounds great, but where's all the stuff for the batteries?
Right.
You know, there's no we're trying to that's. I mean, this is my life, right? This is where my brain goes, and it's just like there's no happy ending.
Yeah.
and so it's difficult, but. Yeah, praying. That I haven't really tried that much. I'll try.
Well, not part of it is recognizing our dependence upon the Creator.
Yeah.
But I also think you're right. And one of my brothers, who actually has done a lot of great research and study in this regard, he says if you just read about the climate change issues and what's going the wrong direction, it's very depressing. After a while, you can get into a rabbit hole there. We need to be informed, but we also need to separate every once in a while and say, okay, what can I do? What's the hope of this day? And the same thing with any problem in the world. We need to find some moments of hope and do something positive. But
this pill that causes abortions, or people
take
the pill after they're conceived.
Mm-hmm.
On TV, they said that it was used safely by 5 million women.
Oh yeah.
And I'm thinking safely
for the women, but not for the child in the womb.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
that's
to
what's
me,
ignored.
when I
Yeah.
justified that against what we've been studying
Mhm.
here. It seems like the world, or parts of the world, have gotten out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's manifesting itself in these other problems. And I think that's what the Pope's trying to say.
Right, they're interrelated. It's all
Right.
interrelated, and that's. But we can't do everything. But I can do this. You can do these things. We can, or collectively we can do something larger. So. But I think recognizing that interrelated nature. That's, I think, a good insight on your part. Thank you. So we'll close with this prayer, and this is the prayer that was written. Not just for Christians, but probably more of a theistic approach, but still from our perspective and Pope Francis. So let's conclude in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, who are so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thank you all for your attention, for being here, and for hopefully engaging in this going forward too.